You're not gonna, no, just do the
How do I turn?
My name is Malcolm Gaddis.
actually about 200 or 300 yards from here, right up on the beginning of Glen Haven Road. And I never knew that I had any relatives around here. And a family genealogist got a hold of me about November of 2002 and explained to me that my uncle was the founder of Soquel, which really kind of surprised me. I didn't even know that, never even heard of the name before. And so when I discovered this, I had quite a few questions, and basically that's what my talk is about today, is those questions that I had, and some of the answers that I found to them. So these are the questions. First of all, is how I'm related to John Hames, and how did I find out? And then where did him and his wife come from? And why did they come here? And what did they do when they were here? And what happened to them? And what is left behind for the rest of us? So that's kind of the outline of my talk today. How am I related to John Hames, and how did I find out? Well, like I say, I've lived in Soquel about 30 years, and I didn't really learn until about a year and a half ago that he was the founder of Soquel and my relative, and that his wife, Drusilla, is buried only a few hundred yards from my house over in the IOOF cemetery on the San Jose Road. And John Hames is my great-great-great-grand uncle. I'm related to him by marriage. His wife, Drusilla, is my blood relative, and she is my great-great-great-grand aunt. John is one of the earliest American settlers of California. A family genealogist and distant cousin, Nathan Haynes, who I'd never known, contacted me in November 2002, tell me that I was related to the founder of the town I lived in. He located me to my sister, who had been talking with him about our pioneer relatives in Oregon, who came to the Willamette Valley in the early 1840s. I came with my parents from eastern Washington to California in 1960. And as a child, I remember going to pioneer picnics in the Blue Mountains of eastern Oregon, up above the town of Pendleton. And many of my relatives in attendance at those reunions were related to Drusilla Shadden, who is the wife of John Hames. So that's my connection. I've known about my family history in Oregon for many years, but didn't know about the Shaddens. Drusilla's maiden name is Shadden. That's the name on our gravestone here in Soquel. Her father is my three greats, grandfather. That's a picture of him over there in the upper left-hand corner of that little presentation board I put together. My great-grandmother, Rose Shadden Walden, is buried in Seaside. She died in 1957. I remember her from my childhood. She sold her homesteaded ranch in Oregon in the 1950s and moved to Seaside. And that's all we ever knew about the Shadden family until a year and a half ago. I don't know if the Oregon family and the California family kept in close contact. When Drusilla died in 1882 in Soquel, my great-grandmother Rose, Drusilla's niece, would have been about 5 years old. So it's possible that Drusilla knew of my great-grandmother. I like to think that there was a living link between the two of them. The grandfather of my great-grandmother Rose was Drusilla's brother, Jasper. Jasper Shadden and his wife Maria were murdered by Mexican nationals in the California Gold Rush era, and their daughter Ellen was returned by the U.S. Cavalry to Thomas Jefferson Shadden, that fellow up there again, in Oregon, who became responsible for her upbringing. I have not found other family members close by in Santa Cruz County. Last names changed through marriage, and people have moved around. Most of what I found out about John Hames is through the Pioneer exhibit in the Soquel Library on Porter Street, thanks to Dick Nutter and others who've worked to preserve the history of Soquel. John and Drusilla's oldest daughter, Martha, or Marty, used to come and speak about the Hames family at Soquel Pioneer picnics and at historical society luncheons. As a matter of fact, you read Maddie's name today in the list of people who had died this past year in 1944. The last picnic that she attended was, we think, somewhere in the late 1930s. She also kept a scrapbook, which is in the California History Museum in Sacramento. She died in 1944, and she's buried next to her mother, Drusilla, here in the cemetery in Soquel. I did learn a little more about John Hames's brother, Benjamin, through some long-lost relatives that I met through the internet on a genealogy website. Benjamin is the founder of Corlitos. Hames Road is named after him. Brother John built the first mill at Corlitos and then gave it to his brother Benjamin. There are quite a few interesting stories written about Benjamin. One of the most interesting has to do with his daughter Rebecca and how her first husband was murdered by a gang of bandits, and the gang was brought to justice by a judge in San Luis Obispo County, the judge had the gang publicly lynched, and Rebecca wound up marrying the judge's brother, who was publisher of the town newspaper. Many members of Benjamin's family are buried at the cemetery on the grounds of Mission San Luis Obispo. The Corlitos Cemetery was plowed up by an apple farmer without removing the graves of Benjamin and other early pioneers. It's a very, very tragic thing. In my research, I also managed to locate a distant cousin who lives in Reno by the name of Elgin Long, who is writing a book about Thomas Jefferson Shadden. Elgin Long and his wife were aviators. They helped start the Aviation Museum in Oakland, and they have searched in the South Seas for the wreckage of Amelia Earhart and have written and published a book about their discovery. Elgin, in doing his research on Thomas Jefferson Shadden, came down here to Soquel to obtain information from me about John and Drusilla Hames. Where did John and Drusilla Hames come from? John Hames was born in Osage, New York on March 22nd, 1811. His father was Benjamin Hames, and his mother was named Rebecca Harding. His father was a surveyor and millwright by trade and a native of New York State. Benjamin, the father, came west in the early days of Western expansion and settled in Battle Creek, Michigan, where he built the first mill. Of course, we know what happened later on in Battle Creek, as the Kellogg's company, of course, started there. The father died in 1850 in Battle Creek. The mother, Rebecca, we don't know much more about her, but she was born near Rochester, New York. John Hames, the guy we're talking about here, sailed on a ship, Phoenix, from around Cape Horn after living and working in Chile, Ecuador, and Peru for a year or two. He worked as a ship's carpenter, and his brother Benjamin arrived in Chile a year later and married a Chilean. John continued on to California and landed first in Monterey in 1843. Benjamin stayed in Chile another year or two before also coming to Monterey. John Hames was Soquel's first American-born citizen. He was not the first English-speaking resident. That distinction went to Michael Lodge, who arrived in Soquel in 1833 from Ireland and married into the Castro family. John Dalvinbus came to Soquel in 1843, a few months after John Hames. John built his first lumber mill at Niles Station, California, which I believe is up in northern Santa Clara County, in 1844 and 45 for General Vallejo. He met his future wife, Drusilla, in either Monterey or Sutter's Fort, which is now Sacramento. They were married in Monterey in 1846, and Drusilla was 13 years old. Drusilla was born in 1833 in Arkansas. Drusilla's family, headed by Thomas Jefferson Shadden, had come out from Lee Creek, Arkansas in 1842. This was several years before the Oregon Trail had been established. There was no established trail yet. This party of wanderers loosely followed the remnants of the expedition done by Marcus and Narcissus Whitman. Drusilla rode a mule all the way across the country from Arkansas at age 10. They first went to Oregon, then later took a ship to California and stayed for 7 years. They arrived at Sutter's Fort on July 8, 1843. At that time, there were less than 500 Americans west of the Mississippi. The Shaddens first lived in a tule hut built by Indians on the banks of the Cosumnes River. John Hames was only 2 years younger than his father-in-law, Thomas Shadden. Thomas moved to McMinnville, Oregon, and left Drusilla behind after she married John. This was the big split in my family history, whereby I never knew of Drusilla until 2002. In fact, it seems that nobody in my Oregon family branch had known of John and Drusilla for perhaps 140 years. Over the years, the Shaddens came to California and returned to Oregon several times. They came once for gold, made a fortune, and returned to Oregon to buy more land. A housing development has just been built near the Shadden family plot in the Masonic Cemetery in McMinnville, Oregon. It's called Shadden Estates. John and Drusilla were married in Monterey. The official ceremony was conducted by Thomas Larkin, U.S. Ambassador to Mexico. Drusilla gave birth, this was a really interesting point, Drusilla gave birth to the first American male born in California. Ben was born at Sutter's Fort on April 9th, 1847, and I'm told that a monument still stands there and mentions that fact. She had 11 more children after that. So, why did John Hames come to California? Thomas Larkin, the ambassador to Mexico in Monterey and a lumber businessman down there, had articles circulated in newspapers in New York asking people to come settle out west so that it would become part of America, as other countries such as Spain, Mexico, England, and Russia were starting to lay claim to different parts of the West. Larkin headed the Mexican consulate in Monterey and was a giant in the lumber industry. Several commercial enterprises had come west to make money off the fur trading business, primarily in the Pacific Northwest. This had caught the imagination of the American people back east, who were beginning to think in terms of manifest destiny, that the whole nation should extend from shore to shore, and that occupation of the land would figure heavily in determining which country would possess the West Coast. So John Hames was apparently caught up in that vision as he came to California with high ideals and lots of energy. Half a generation or so later, there were other great men who came to this area and made fortunes, people like Frederick Heen and Adolph Spreckels. John Hames came to make his fortune, but also to help settle California and bring it into the Union. He was an American patriot. The risks in coming to California at that time were huge. Very few people could speak English. There were grizzly bears all over the Santa Cruz Mountains. So coming here and starting a lumber mill in the early 1840s was no easy task. You have to be driven by a higher purpose than just coming to make easy money. What did John Hames do when he got here? Well, John knew Thomas Larkin, the Mexican consulate in Monterey, and the first successful lumber businessman. John had apparently learned how to build water-powered mills from his father back in New York. The father eventually started the first mill in Battle Creek. John came to Soquel and acquired land to build his first lumber mill on Soquel Creek. The lumber mill was located right about where Tampico Kitchen is located now, across the creek from Soquel Elementary School. John Dobbinbiss also arrived in Soquel about the same time as John Hames. Dobbin Biss came across the plains on the same wagon train as Drusilla, my aunt, who came with her father, Thomas Jefferson Shadden. Together, Hames and Dobbin Biss cooperated on a lot of projects and shared the same sentiments. John Hames acquired a large piece of land from Martina Castro, one of the first generation members of the Castro family, who obtained her land grant from Mexico. His land extended from roughly Soquel High School, across Soquel Creek, and extended downstream to the high tide mark at Capitola Beach. He and Dobbin Biss also owned a piece of land that extended from Moran Beach at 26th Street and up into the Rodeo Gulch area. He obtained 3 different parcels over the years from 3 different members of the Castro family. He sold part of one of the land grants to Dobbin Biss and then took in Dobbin Biss as a business partner on the first mill that he built in Soquel. Together they turned the redwood into plank and board, and the lumber from their mill shipped to faraway places like the Hawaiian Islands. Here are a few of John Hames's most noteworthy accomplishments. He was the father of 12 children and started the first school in Soquel. It stood where Soquel Elementary School now stands. He served on the first Board of Supervisors for the County of Santa Cruz and was the chairman of it in 1850. He initiated construction of the old Soquel Road, which was the first road into Santa Cruz County from Santa Clara County. He was a friend of James Marshall's and was at Sutter's Mill in 1848, the day that gold was discovered, while he was working on the mill. To quote the words of Drusilla Hames, "The Mormon boys were working at the mills for Sutter with Marshall as foreman. One of these brothers found the gold and handed it to Marshall, who in turn gave it to Sutter, who sent it to San Francisco, where it was pronounced gold." And we all know what happened after that. He was the first person to raise the Stars and Stripes in San Jose, California. It was a small banner about 6 feet long. He put it on a little willow pole that surmounted an old adobe building. He knew some of the most powerful and influential people in Northern California at that time. General Sherman of the Civil War fame slept in John's mill on Soquel Creek. And John knew General Fremont as well. He served in Captain Charles M. Weber's Company of California Volunteers during the war with Mexico. He served from July 15th, 1846 to February 10th, 1847. Weber was the founder of Stockton, California. He went gold mining in Mazatlan, Mexico, where he became sick. His brother Benjamin had to come down and get him in Mazatlan, bring him back home. He was too sick to travel. Not as nearly as much as recorded about Aunt Drusilla. She was kind. She was generous, according to the records. She taught people around here how to speak English and learned to speak Spanish. She worked at different jobs to help John buy machinery in San Francisco to install in his mill. Well, what happened to John Hames? Over the years, history has forgotten about John Hames. How could he go from being such a great early American hero to being almost completely forgotten? I don't know if I got the answer to that question. He built a house near Soquel High School and the area known as O'Neill Ranch, which is the tall hill behind the high school. It used to be known as Hames Hill. In a rainstorm one winter, the graves of 2 of his infant sons were washed away from that hillside and into Soquel Creek. The Porter family, the largest landowners in the state of California, eventually acquired his land. J.J. O'Neill eventually owned a part of Hames's land as well and lived in the house that Hames had built. The house was destroyed in 1947. It stood near where O'Neill Street intersects the old San Jose Road by the high school. John Hames lost his first lumber mill when he left Soquel to go fight the War of 1846. When he returned, Martina Castro and her new husband, Michael Lodge, had taken it over. John fought for legal ownership of it in San Francisco, but the laws of the time were very sketchy, because of the transition from Spanish-Mexican to American laws, and he eventually lost the land. Some of his losses were also due to investments that didn't work out. He loaned money to Brother Benjamin and never got it back. He built a second mill on Soquel Creek, upstream about 100 yards or so from the current Bridge Street footbridge. If you hike up Soquel Creek from Bridge Street, you can find some old concrete pilings that locals up there say are left over from that mill. Frederick Heen and the Porter family eventually got nearly all of John Hames's land. This was probably due to the fact that John was a nice guy. He was trusting, didn't particularly like squabbles, and was quickly exhausted by legal disputes. As I was saying earlier, he went to Mazatlan, Mexico to hunt for gold, and presumably planned on buying back more land around Soquel to reestablish what he had lost. The written history is a little fuzzy on the order of events that happened next, but it goes something like this. In 1883, he moved to Bradley, California, in southern Monterey County, below King City. There he owned 10,000 acres and raised sheep. He seemed to enjoy the peace and serenity of the area, but somehow I get the feeling that Drusilla did not, and may have remained behind in Soquel. Around this time, he went to Mexico to look for gold so he could buy his land back that he lost in Soquel. But Frederick Heen owned the second mill that John had built, a flour mill, and Drusilla was living nearby while John was in Mexico. And her and her children were evicted from the home that they were living in. Where it was, I'm not quite sure. She took refuge in the old flour mill. The Heen had allowed her to do that, and she got sick and she died there in 1882. Meanwhile, John Hames got sick while in Mexico. His brother Benjamin went to Mexico and brought him back to Peachtree in Monterey County. Peachtree is a grand old mission-style mansion built on a cattle ranch by the famous cattle baron Henry Miller. I think this is where John Hames died. I corresponded with the current caretakers of the Peachtree Ranch, and they never got back with me. But there is an old cemetery there. I've looked in other cemeteries and registries in the area, and the next most likely place would be the mission at San Luis Obispo, where many of other Brother Benjamin's people are buried. There's also a cemetery in Bradley that I haven't investigated yet either. So what is left behind for the rest of us? It is surprising how much one man did so early on in California history, and yet so little remains to be known about him. It's a miracle that I found out about him at all. What is in the Pioneer exhibit in the Soquel Library contains almost all the information I've given you. There's nothing anywhere that I've seen in Soquel in the way of landmarks, street names, or monuments that mentions the name of the town founder. The historical mural in the Soquel post office mentions nothing about him. I have found no other family members in the area but me. In the article in a 1962 issue of the California History magazine gives a casual single reference to John Hames, stating that he built the first lumber mill on Soquel Creek. I went to Bradley, California in December 2002 to see what else I could find out about the life of John Hames. There is an old farmhouse along Highway 101 at the Bradley turnoff. I found that John Hames built that house in the 1880s. I learned this from my long-lost cousins who I met over the internet. The oldest living person in Bradley, a woman in her 90s, who is the town historian, told me that the house was old when she was a little girl and that nobody knew who built it. So I told her the story. The house is now on a ranch owned by the Porter family, the same family that had acquired John Hames's land in Soquel. The people living there in 2002, when I visited, were caretakers for the ranch. They let me come inside, look around, and take pictures. I went through lock gates to an old family cemetery where many Porters are buried, and looked for John Hames's grave site there, but couldn't find one. The ranch is now planted in wine grapes. It's located in a valley called Hames Valley. A winery on the land is called Hames Valley Winery. I have a brochure in my presentation over here showing a little more detail about the winery. It says on the label of the wine that the valley was named after some long-forgotten man from New York. I searched through Monterey County records for a death certificate, and the clerk told me that that was too long ago and no records were kept back then. An old article in the Santa Cruz Daily Surf newspaper, dated 1883, says that he moved to San Francisco, but I've found no other records yet that concur with that. A couple of interesting side notes. The old Last Supper Wax Museum on Ocean Street. I don't know, does any of you remember seeing that thing? That was created by John Hames's grandson, Harry Liston, who was the son of Mattie Hames, who we talked about earlier. Also, Charles Langley established the community of Prunedale near Salinas, and according to the family records, he was John Hames's grandson through daughter Lucretia. My long-lost cousin in Reno, Elton Long, expressed some interest a year ago in having a new gravestone and monument put up for Drusilla. The presentation today is being captured on videotape, thanks to Patricia over here. And a few copies will go into the Pioneer exhibit in the Soquel Library on DVD. I'm really thankful for the efforts of the people who have preserved the history of my ancestors, because without that, it would all be forgotten. It would be nice for each of us to reflect back on this early history and do what we can to help preserve it for posterity. To paraphrase an American novelist, Wallace Stegner, we may not know where we're going in the future, but we do know where we come from, and that truly is our identity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. I think it's interesting to note that the very property we sit has a connection to your presentation, because this property belonged to Heen. That flagpole right there is in memory of Michael Lodge, who was involved with John Hames. The barbecue pit out here was donated by the Lodge sisters in memory of Martina Castro. So this whole thing has a major connection. So I think that's really interesting. Our final presentation today is getting kind of lengthy, but I think it's important to note that although we had the people that made Soquel what it is today, it's our environment and our topography and our creek down here. And we have Don Alley, who is going to give a presentation on, what's happening in this stream. And he has been very familiar with this for a number of years. I think we have an interest in that. And Don, I'd like to have you come forward and give a presentation on what your observations have been.
Let's see. Thanks, Dick.